Tonight I was going to talk about filial piety. In other words, if you like, one's duties towards one's parents, one's supporting and looking after one's parents in life. And I think one reason I was thinking about that was because I know it's Chinese New Year today, and I think most people think about Chinese culture. One of the things they think about is filial piety, looking after your parents, looking after the elders in society. It's very much part of Chinese and probably also Asian culture in general. But I think it's also, filial piety is also a universal principle that is true in all cultures. Every culture aspires to this beautiful thing of looking after one's family, looking after one's parents in particular. So it's really, I think, it's true in Australia, it's true, I think, in all countries. So it really is a universal principle, an important moral principle at that. And of course, not only is it universal if you look around the world and you look at different cultures, but it's also a very important principle in Buddhism. When you start reading the word of the Buddha, he often talks about the kind of debt of gratitude that we have to our parents, the sort of things that we are supposed to do to our parents. He talks about parents. Sometimes he compares parents favorably to almost anybody else in society. We know that in Buddhism we often talk about, for example, people who are enlightened perhaps, or who are very good meditators and gain very deep meditation. But the interesting thing is that the Buddha said that even above those, monastics perhaps often, who are very good at meditation practice and may have very deep insight, sometimes parents go first. They go before even these people. So there's a they're very highly, put very highly in the Buddhist doctrines or the Buddhist ideas of how we should actually act in the world. And that is very, very fascinating. So for that reason, I think it's an important topic, and I want to talk about a few of the things that the Buddha said about this particular topic tonight. And one of the interesting things that the Buddha said in one particular place is that there's three things in life that wise people say that we should be doing, that we should be practicing here. And those three things, he said, are 1, generosity, 2, the going forth, and 3, filial piety, or the looking after the duty towards one's parents. So these are the three things that wise people prescribe in the world, that good people prescribe, that we should be doing. Now, if you think about those three things, the first one is generosity. Now, we all know that generosity is a very foundational aspect of Buddhist practice. It's something that often comes even before virtue, because sometimes it's easier to actually be generous than it is to be virtuous. It's very foundational, and it often comes at the very beginning of the Buddhist path. And the second thing here that the Buddha mentions here is the going forth. In other words, becoming a monastic, a nun, or a monk. And we all know how important that is in Buddhism, because the monastic sangha is essentially the vehicle, usually, that carries Buddhism forward in the sense that it understands the teachings, the deepest, usually, not always, but usually, and also because they specialize in these teachings. They actually read the suttas, and they have the most of the time anyway, the most profound understanding of what the Buddha's teaching is about. So the going forth is fundamental to Buddhist practice. So here you have generosity, the going forth, two very important factors. And the third one is supporting one's parents. That is quite remarkable. It shows you how important this quality is, that it actually goes with these two other extremely fundamental things in the Buddhist practice. So that is how important they are. And as I mentioned before, sometimes the Buddha talks about, the Buddhist teachings is often very structured, and you read often there is like a sequence of things that you find in the teachings of the Buddha. It's always sequential. Things have a certain structure to them. And the Buddha talks about, for example, where a person should spend their money, where they should spend their wealth. If you go out and you work in the right way, you have a correct type of livelihood, where you don't do anything wrong in the world, you do good things in the world, and after a while you accumulate some wealth. Now, how should you spend that wealth? And the Buddha said, well, the first person that you should look after when you have acquired some wealth is yourself. And this is very much one of those, again, foundational principles of Buddhism. We are closest to ourselves. There's no person in the world that we love more than ourselves. So we look after ourselves, number one. The second one we should look after, and this is maybe a bit more interesting, a bit more kind of unusual, is our parents. And our parents come before our spouse or our children. Our parents are second only to ourselves. And again, that shows you how highly they come. And then you have, ascetics and Brahmins, that is monks and nuns, they come even further down, I think, on that particular list. So again, it shows you the power and the importance of looking after one's parents in this practice. I'm going to read you out one sutta. This is from the Buddha. And one of the things that is said about parents again. This is again to give you some idea what the Buddha actually said, rather than what I am saying or anybody else is saying. And I will explain to you what this is all about, which is coming now, because some of the terminology here is no doubt a bit unfamiliar for you. So what the Buddha said was something as follows. Those families dwell with Brahma, where at home the mother and father are revered by their children. Those families dwell with the ancient teachers, where at home the mother and father are revered by their children. Those families dwell with the gift-worthy, where at home the mother and father are revered by their children. Brahma is a metaphor for mother and father. Ancient teachers is a metaphor for mother and father. Gift-worthy is a metaphor for mother and father. Why? Mother and father are very helpful to their children. They raise them, nurture them, and show them the world. So this is one of the suttas where the Buddha talks about parents and how important it is. And to understand what is going on here, I'm going to explain to you very briefly what is meant by this, because it says here that those families dwell with Brahma, where the mother and father are revered by their children. Now, what does it mean to dwell with Brahma? What is this Brahma idea? Now, there's many ways you can understand what Brahma is. One way is to simply know that Brahma is the highest god in the Hindu religion, the ancient Brahmanical religion that existed in India 2,500 years ago, is basically the forerunner of what we now know as Hinduism. In those days, the main god of that religion was Brahma. It was sometimes like the fundamental, or the ground of consciousness, sometimes it was called, or sometimes it was like more of a personal god as well. But it's the highest one. So here, what they're saying is that when you dwell correctly towards your parents, you are dwelling with like the highest God in the universe. It's almost like a Christian was saying, you are dwelling with God when you are dwelling respectfully towards your parents. But another way of understanding this, and this is more like a Buddhist way, if you like, is that in Brahma, in Buddhism, means something like the highest. And you may have heard the word known as the Brahma Viharas. The Brahma Viharas are often translated as the divine abidings. And these are the kind of emotions that we try to develop in Buddhism. This is the metta, the loving kindness emotion, the compassion, and the sympathetic joy and the equanimity. These are the four Brahma Viharas, divine abidings. Now these Brahma Viharas, when they are developed fully, they lead to this also very high states of rebirth, according to the Buddha's teachings. And what these states are like, they are states that are free of anger, free of desire. They are states of contentment, where you have no restlessness, where the mind is clear and bright, there's no sloth and torpor there, and it's firm, there's no doubt, there's no wavering in the mind. And they're also very, very blissful states. So this is what this is about. Dwelling with Brahma here means that when you have this kind of attitude towards your parents, there's no ill will, there's no anger, there's no irritation, there's no desire for them to be this way or that way. There's pure love, pure acceptance. That is when you're dwelling rightly and respectfully towards your parents. There's a very high standard you can see that they're talking about here. This is not easy to attain, to get to, obviously talk about that later on. But this is the kind of what he's talking about here, the Buddha, when he talks about revering mother and father in the home by their children. And the second aspect here he talks about here is that this is like dwelling with the ancient teachers. Now what does this idea of ancient teachers actually refer to? And I think as Buddhists, The idea of ancient teachers are people like the Buddha himself, or when you read about the great, maybe monastics of the past, to people like Venerable Sariputta, or the great nuns like Venerable Kema, Ayakema, and Uppalavanna, and these arahants that existed a long time ago. These are like our ancient teachers. Or you can take teachers that are more contemporary, like people like Ajahn Chah, perhaps, or other people that have passed away more recently. These are also like ancient teachers. So here, what the Buddha is saying, that we should place our mother and father at the same level as these teachers which we revere so highly here. And that is an amazing statement. It doesn't mean, of course, that we take that these ancient, our mother and father have the same kind of wisdom or the same understanding or the same meditation as the Buddha or as Venerable Sariputta. That's not what it means. What it means is that we have the same kind of respect, we have the same generosity here, we have the same kind of loving kindness towards our parents as we would have towards somebody who is the most highly spiritual developed person that we can possibly think of. Again, it's a very high standard, but that is a standard that is being spoken of here in this particular sutta. And the last one here, he's saying that our parents are gift-worthy. Now again, if you know the way the Buddha talked about gift-worthiness, you know that gift-worthiness by the Buddha is usually said to be those people who are on the path to becoming fully enlightened. These are the people that are normally called gift-worthy in the suttas by the Buddha. And here they're saying that parents again are on the same level. They are gift-worthy in much the same way as people who are on the path to enlightenment, to full awakening, if you like. Yeah. So there's some very strong use of words here. And that's why the Buddha says that mother and father is a metaphor. Brahma is a metaphor for mother and father. The highest God is a way of talking about mother and father. Mother and father are like the ancient teachers. They are gift-worthy. Why? And this, of course, is the crux of the matter here. Why is it the case? And the reason, it says here, is because they raise us, they nurture us, and they show us the world. That is what the Buddha says here. Now, I want to talk a bit about the meaning of this now, and I want to focus on this particular thing, because what happens is when you think about your parents in a different way, when you think about what they have done for us, and this is the why question here, that they nurture us and look after us, then you give rise to a sense of gratitude towards your parents. And this is what this is all about. And I think sometimes one of the problems with our modern society, maybe with the way that psychology was taught maybe over the past 20, 30 years, I remember myself, there was a time when people were talking about always finding the problems, your present problems, always to be found in your past, in this life. And of course, a big part of our past is our family life and our parents. So very often, one would then say that our parents are the cause for all our problems, whether they're psychological problems, or we get angry too easily, or we get upset or anxious, or whatever it is. Parents are the cause. Parents have transferred their own problems onto us through their upbringing by not being wise and skillful enough, and they're passing their own stupidity, or whatever you want to call it, down through the generation, from one generation to the next one, and on it goes, according to certain ideas of psychology. And of course, if you think like that, if you think that your parents are the cause of all your problems and all the bad things in your life, you don't get any gratitude. Instead, you get fault-finding, you get negative, and you start complaining about those parents rather than finding anything positive about them. And this is a very dangerous thing, according to the Buddha's teachings, because this is leading us in exactly the opposite way of where we want to go. So it really is it's not a very skillful way of doing it. I don't know if those psychologists who actually use these techniques really wanted us to be negative about our parents. They probably don't want that. They probably just want to help us out to resolve our problems. But it can be an outcome of focusing on the negative things. It can be the outcome that we become critical of our parents. And that is, in my opinion, a very, very negative and very bad outcome. And one of the problems here, and from a Buddhist point of view, is that all our problems, all the things that we have in life, the things that don't work for us, They don't come from our parents. Maybe a small amount does, maybe a little bit of the few things that they have passed on to us affects us. Certainly, if you had a very bad upbringing, sometimes people get abused very badly as children, of course, that can be very traumatic. But most of our personality traits, from a Buddhist point of view, they come, of course, from a past life. They don't come because of anything at all which has happened in this life right here and now. And when we understand that, it transforms the whole idea of psychology and of how to look after people and how to actually change our behavior. And it would be very interesting, I think, if psychology accepted the idea of rebirth, because it really would transform the way they would have to practice their trade if they took into account that a lot of the problems that we have as humans do not come from this life. In fact, the vast majority will come from past lives, from a previous time. And that would change the outlook very, very dramatically here. And once we understand that this is really where our problems come from, then it has nothing to do with our parents. And our parents are really quite irrelevant for who we are as people. And sometimes you can see in families, you can see two brothers or two sisters or a brother and sister growing up in the same family. And the characters can be enormously different. Now, how can that be if the parents and the environment is the main conditioning factor? Of course, it can often be very difficult to explain. However, if you take into account the past lives, it becomes much more obvious how people can be so different, even when the conditioning is virtually the same. So this is, in a sense, the Buddhist point of view, and it takes away a lot of the idea of actually being victimized by our parents, being victimized by society around us. If we feel like victims, we are powerless. There's nothing much we can do about our life, because all our problems are caused by the circumstances around us. But if we accept that we are the final decision maker, we are the person who actually control our lives, then we become powerful. It empowers us. It makes it possible for us to make a difference. We can change. We can actually do something with our lives. And that sense of empowerment is very important and is very fundamental to the Buddhist view of life, that we are empowered and we can change the way we think, the way we do things, which can change our sufferings into happiness, and we can turn things around. And this is so important. And of course, coming back to parents again, the reason why we have the parents that we have anyway, usually again, if you look at it from a point of view of rebirth and karma, it is because we had attachments and desires for these parents in the past life. We are the reason why we have those parents. And then it does not make much sense to actually complain about the parents we have. In a way, we chose those parents ourselves. So then how can we really complain about having the parents that we have? And of course, lastly, people are just people. It doesn't matter which parents you have in the world. All parents are going to have their flaws. It's not going to help you very much to change the parents you had to somebody else, because they're going to have different flaws. They're going to have something else that wasn't right. You may be miserable in a different way, but that's about the only change you're going to have. So ultimately, it is the wrong track to go down. It's a dangerous track to go down to try to blame our parents for our problems. Instead, we have to forgive them for their human frailties. We have to accept that our parents are human beings just like everybody else. This, of course, can be difficult. It's one of those processes of growing up in the world to understand that your parents are just human beings like everybody else. And we have to accept them, and we have to forgive them for their frailties, absolutely, fully, unconditionally. And then we can start to move on towards gratitude. So then the next thing, once you have actually overcome this idea of blaming your parents, is to understand the great importance that parents have for us in life, how incredibly significant they are for us, for our existence, for who we are. And you often know that when a child gets born into a family, parents will often say that their whole time basically is occupied with this child. Their whole life revolves around this child. It's almost as if their own life sort of disappears into the background, and now they become like a slave for this child that has come into the world. And that, I think, is often how people see it when they have children. And there is some interesting research done on people's happiness when they have a child, and usually the happiness in a person's life drops down dramatically when a child comes into the world. It's a strange thing, but this seems to be the case. And the reason, of course, is because you are more stressed out. You wake up in the middle of the night when your baby is crying. You're running around doing errands for your children all the time, buying them this, buying that, driving them here, driving them there. And of course, you're going to feel stressed, and there's going to be a certain amount of suffering connected with that. Of course, the interesting thing is that those surveys also show that overall people feel more satisfied with life when they have children. But at the time, it seems that actually it is a source of suffering for people, which is quite interesting here. So there's both a satisfaction there and a source of suffering at the same time. But if you think about it, we are completely, as human beings, completely 100% dependent on our parents. Everything we learn, everything we do comes from our parents. The Buddha says here that your parents raise you and they nurture you. They look after you, they clothe you, they feed you, they get you to school. They do all these things without which you would perish straight away pretty much. A human being, when it's born, is so absolutely, completely helpless. There's nothing we can, pretty much the first 4 or 5 years of our lives, we're at the mercy of the elements around us. And our parents are there as our guards to protect us from the world, to make sure that we can even survive. And then they teach us about the world. And this is the other thing the Buddha says here. The parents show the children the world. Without our parents, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. Everything, almost everything we know in the first 10 or 15 years of our lives comes from our parents. They teach us how to do very basic and simple things in life, like getting clothed, like washing ourselves, going to the toilet, how to deal with people, how to brush our teeth, how to do the washing and cleaning up, how to do the cooking. Almost everything we know in those early years. And you really have to think about it. There's a lot. There's an enormous amount of things that our parents have transferred to us over those years. Start reflecting on that, and you start to see that it's quite remarkable how much it actually is. And when you start to see this, you start to see that actually the debt of gratitude here is like a mountain. It really is an enormous mountain of things that we have gotten from our parents from the time we were born until maybe we were 15, maybe even 20 years older. And that becomes something very powerful in the mind when you reflect on that. And it's very, very important to reflect like this, to understand what actually is going on here. And then, when you reflect like this, things start to turn around. You start to see, instead of having the complaining mind, the mind in which you feel victimized by your parents, you start to give rise to a sense of gratitude inside of you. There's nobody in the world, and I mean absolutely nobody. Actually, no, I don't mean that. What I mean is that there may be somebody who is you can be even more grateful to, but generally speaking, the parents are the people in the world by far who have done the most for you in this entire world. There is an exception to that. I might talk about that later on, but that is generally speaking the case. Now, how can we make this more solid? How can we make it very clear to ourselves that this actually is the case? And I thought just the other day I was sitting in the monastery, and there was somebody I thought I should tell off because they were doing some strange things. And then I sat back to myself and I thought, well, if I'm going to say something to this person, I should always say, 4 or 5 nice things to them first of all. Like we always learn about how we should deal with people. Say a few nice things, and in the sandwich technique, put the bad thing in there and say something nice afterwards again. So I sat back and I thought about this person. Now, what has this person ever done? What are the nice things about this person? And I thought about some very concrete and obvious things. Well, he actually did this particular thing. He did this particular thing. He did this particular thing. And after counting about 4 or 5 things, I thought, wow, this person is actually quite a nice person. Why on earth do I want to tell this person off? And it's a bit like that with your parents. When you start thinking, when you think about your parents, don't just think, yeah, they were compassionate and kind. they had, they were giving when they were, they were giving and generous when they had to be. Think about very specific incidents of what they did in your life, because those specific incidents, I find, have so much more power in the mind to understand the kindness of a person, the kindness coming from their heart, than a kind of general feeling of kindness, which doesn't really say very much. So be very specific and bring those to mind. Imagine yourself that you just sit back, now what are the good things that my parents did for me in my life? And start counting them up. And this is a beautiful way of actually giving rise to this sense of gratitude. So try these things. And then, last of all, I recommend you bring your parents into your metta meditation. This is what I tried to do before at the beginning here. Bring them in, because that way is a beautiful way of actually purifying yourself of any kind of remaining negativity that you may have. And that will support your practice of looking after them, of doing the right thing towards them. And that can become very powerful. So bring them in as well, into that metta. It can be very hard to have metta towards one's parents. Our relationships with our parents are so complex. There are so many, there's a mixture of negative things and good things and neutral things and all kinds of stuff. And because it is a complex relationship, sometimes you try to do the metta, it doesn't work. So you have to work on it. You have to try hard again and again to bring it up and actually purify those negative states that you may still have in your mind towards your parents. And gradually, stage by stage, you will see that things actually change. So what happens then? What happens as you grow in gratitude towards your parents? What happens is that you start, of course, to behave differently as well. And what is it that we should do towards our parents? What are the things that we should sort of look after them? How should we do this? And you will find that it's very obvious. It's very obvious what we have to do. It's not very difficult to understand. And of course, the most simple one, the most basic one, is to look after them, particularly in old age, to make sure that they have material well-being, that they don't suffer materially. That's obviously a very important one. And particularly in ancient India, this was kind of thing that was very important. But I think in our society, maybe more important than material well-being is the psychological well-being of our parents. To make sure that they're not lonely, that they have somebody to talk to when they need to, that we visit them every now and again. These things are very important. And that is one of those negative things in our society, that often people are lonely in our society. They don't really have any friends. They don't have anywhere to go. They don't have anybody to share their experiences with in life. And that's a very sad predicament. And particularly if you get older, if you get immobile, you can't really walk, you can't really get around anymore, it's very easy to get isolated. So that is one of the things, one of the kind of the very common experience, I think, among old people in our society, that they feel lonely and left behind, and there's nobody really to talk to. And this is where we should support them psychologically by making sure that they're looked after. And if you practice in the right way, if you think in the right way, this will come naturally. It won't be a burden on you. It won't be something that you have to really force yourself to do. Sometimes you may have to force yourself, but there will be much less force if you practice correctly than if you do it otherwise. Because one of the sad things about looking after one's parents is if you do it simply because it's a duty. I have to do it, it's my responsibility, your heart is not in it, and that becomes a very negative way of doing it. If you can do it with a good heart, actually wanting to do it, understanding the importance of doing it, having a sense of gratitude, then it becomes a very, very beautiful thing, both for yourself and also for your parents, because they can feel that you're coming from your heart when you do it in the right way. And that means so much to everybody when somebody does something kind, coming from the heart, rather than just perfunctory, because this is how you've been brought up, and this is what you're supposed to be doing for them. So these are some of the things that you can look out for. But one of the interesting things, I'm going to take this a little bit deeper now, and one of the interesting things the Buddha had to say about how to look after one's parents, that is what I'm going to talk about next. Now this is another very famous sutta or discourse by the Buddha about how to look after your parents. And this explains to us how in the ultimate sense what the kind of highest way of giving back to our parents actually is. And the Buddha says the following: there are two persons that cannot easily be repaid. What two? One's mother and father. Even if one should carry about one's mother on one shoulder and one's father on the other for 100 years, and if one should attend to them by anointing them with balms, by massaging, bathing, and rubbing their limbs, one still would not have repaid one's parents. Even if one were to establish one's parents as the supreme lords and rulers over this great earth, one still would not have repaid one's parents. For what reason? Parents are of great help to their children. They bring them up, feed them, and show them the world. But if, when one's parents lack faith, one encourages, settles, and establishes them in faith, if, when one's parents are immoral, one encourages, settles, and establishes them in virtuous behavior, if, when one's parents are miserly, one encourages, settles, and establishes them in generosity, and if, when one's parents are unwise, one encourages, settles, and establishes them in wisdom, in such a way one has repaid one's parents and done more than enough for them. So that is a very powerful sutta. The Buddha says that even if you make your parents the lords and rulers of this entire earth, still you haven't really repaid them. Now that is a pretty difficult thing to do. So I don't think that is the way to go about repaying them. But the interesting thing here, what he says, is that if we do help our parents in a spiritual sense, then we can actually repay them. Now, why is it that somehow helping them in the spiritual sense does repay people in this way? And of course, the answer is that when you help people in a spiritual sense, you give them a profound sense of contentment and happiness that is not only for this life, but also for future lives. And even, you are perhaps even helping them, if you like, on the way to Nibbana itself. And that is why this is so important, and that's why this kind of repayment is different from all other types of repayment. And you find that in the suttas, one of the interesting things that the Buddha did after he attained his great awakening experience, after that, one of the first things the Buddha did was to go back to his clan, his family, if you like. And he visited his parents, he visited his ex-wife, and he visited his son. And of course, one of the wonderful things that happened was that his foster mother, his mother had already died, but his foster mother, she became a bhikkhuni, a nun under the Buddha. And she later on also attained full awakening by practicing the Buddhist path. And that, of course, is the example of how to repay your parents to the max, and much more than actually repaying them, because you provide them with the supreme Buddhist happiness. And then the Buddha's son, also the famous story of the Buddha's son. When the Buddha went back home, the son's mother saw the Buddha in the distance, and she told the son, who was named Rahula, "Go to your father and ask for your inheritance." I think she was being a bit cheeky. She was trying to I don't know exactly what she was trying to do, but she was obviously being a bit cheeky. And so the son runs up to the Buddha and says, "Father," son was only small, 7 or 8 years old, and says to the Buddha, "Father, Father, give me my inheritance, give me my inheritance." And of course the Buddha says, Venerable Sariputta, which was his right-man monk, he says to him, "Ordain Rahula, ordain my son." And that's how he became ordained. And that is how you gain your inheritance in the Buddha's teachings, because that is how you give somebody the highest possible happiness. And you find this also in the contemporary circumstances, the same kind of thing. You find that Ajahn Chah, for example, his mother actually ordained under Ajahn Chah, and she became a nun under him, practices as actually one of his disciples. And there was one situation where Ajahn Chah's mother went up to him and wanted to offer him some robes. And Ajahn Chah said, "No, you shouldn't offer the robes to me. If you want to offer it, you should offer it to the Sangha." So in other words, we should break this attachment, this mother-son attachment. Now we practice in the Dhamma. We should practice the way that gives rise to the most happiness and the most benefit in the world, which is offering the robe to the entire Sangha. It's a beautiful way, a beautiful thing to do. And one of the things that I have also found even in my own life, which is very, 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 very humble compared to some of these great monks, yet some of the things that I found out in my own life is that I have seen a similar, I shouldn't say similar, a similar kind of transformation in my own parents over time. And it's an amazing thing to see here. I remember when I first decided I wanted to become a monk, my parents thought I was crazy. They thought, why on earth do you want to become a Buddhist monk for her? And they thought I was going to go into some kind of a sect or something and disappear from the surface of the planet, never to be seen again, and be dragged into some kind of unwholesome, thing. And they were actually very concerned about that because they had no idea about what Buddhism was all about. And they were saying among each other, I was told afterwards, where have we failed in the upbringing that he's becoming a Buddhist monk? That's the kind of thing they were thinking. I was telling them, you haven't failed at all. You have succeeded in your upbringing. If somebody can take a choice like becoming a Buddhist monk, surely you must have succeeded. It's a difficult choice to make. It's not that easy. So you have made somebody who is broad-minded enough to consider even the most unusual occupations in the world. You must have succeeded. Surely you haven't failed. But they weren't really ready for that at the time. But over time and gradually over the years, the transformation has happened. Like over the last maybe 5 years, they have started to read Buddhist books. They come to me and they ask, when I go back home, they say, why don't you give us a small Dhamma talk so we understand what this Buddhism is all about? And sometimes we have discussions about Dhamma, about virtue, and about what is the right way of practicing the world. And my father said, I used to be sort of inclined towards Christianity, not anymore. And it's a wonderful thing to see that happening in your parents. I don't think they are Buddhist exactly, but you can see the transformation that is happening there. And now there's no doubt that they're proud of me as a Buddhist monk. And I think it's a wonderful thing that I'm doing what I'm doing. And that is a kind of change which is actually quite great. And what makes that possible? How can we actually make sure that we are able to bring our parents in this way, to also share some of the benefits of the path with us? And I think the most important thing of all is to just try to be an example ourselves of what the Buddhist path is all about. Don't try to go back and tell them, the Buddha said this, you must practice in this way. If you do that, they're going to turn off straight away and they're not going to listen. What you have to do, and this is what seems to work to me, is just to be nice and be kind, do the right thing. They know that you're a Buddhist, they know that you're practicing in this way, and after a while they will start to listen to what you have to say. They will be interested in what you're doing simply because you are a good person. It is your character, it is who you are that turns people on and makes them interested in what you're doing, not what you're saying. We know that very well from life, that example is the most powerful thing, not what we say. But sometimes it's actually very difficult to do in practice because you have to be very, very patient. And sometimes it just doesn't work. Some people are never going to change. And for that reason, sometimes you just have to shrug your shoulders and say, okay, fine. If they don't change, that's fine. If they do, it's fine. You shouldn't place any emotional investment into whether other people actually come around to your way of viewing things or not. Then you have a chance of actually slowly getting there. So this is one of the beautiful ways of actually bringing your parents around to even the spiritual aspects of Buddhism. And then it becomes something very powerful and beautiful. But the last thing I want to say here, and this is one of the things that I realized very recently. There was a small discussion, I don't know if you've seen, the Buddhist Society has this website, and there's a forum on this website. And sometimes these questions come up on this forum. And recently somebody asked about the question about why is it that mother and father is mentioned in the very first of the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path? Why is mother and father in there, they asked. And it's very strange when you look at the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. This is a factor of right view, the right way of looking at the world. Now one aspect of that right view, it says quite literally, there is mother and father. It's a very cryptic statement. Of course there is mother and father. What do you mean there is mother and father? It's a bit strange. And the answer is to that question is that the first aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, is all about rebirth and the law of karma. So when you understand that the reason why mother and father is mentioned in there is because they are such important aspects in this doctrine of rebirth and karma. They are so important, in fact, that they are specifically mentioned in the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path of right view. That's how important it is. Now that is very powerful if you think about it. I mean, the Noble Eightfold Path is the most important teaching on the way out of suffering, on the way to Nibbana, on the way to happiness. It's the one guideline that we have more than anything else in life. And in this guideline, at the very beginning, mother and father are mentioned in terms of karma and rebirth. That is extraordinarily important and extraordinarily powerful. There must be a reason why it's there. It wouldn't be there unless it was very important. Now, to understand how it is important and why it is important, and consider that one of the teachings of the Buddha was when he explained the 5 worst kind of crimes that we can commit as human beings. They're often called the 5 heinous crimes because they're so bad. So these are the 5 worst things, basically, you can do as a human being. The creating of the 5 worst possible types of karma. And these are shedding the blood of a Buddha with a malicious mind state. They are creating a schism, a division in the Sangha. They are killing an arahant. An arahant is a fully awakened being. So these are the 3 things. It sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Wounding a Buddha with a mind of ill will, creating a schism in the Sangha, killing a full enlightened being. That's pretty bad stuff. And the last 2 are killing your mother and father. These are the 5 worst things you can do in life. Killing your mother and father is up there with killing a fully enlightened person. It's the same kind of karma. That is pretty remarkable. Now, what does that mean in practice? In practice, that means that our parents are a very, very powerful field for our actions, for our karma. Extremely powerful. And whatever action that we do towards our parents will be amplified enormously. So whatever bad action that we do towards our parents will have very, very powerful consequences. So if we speak badly to our parents, it will be very powerful in terms of karmic consequences. If we do bad actions, the same thing. And even if we think bad things towards our parents, it will have very negative consequences in the future. But the reverse is also true, because karma also always has 2 sides to it. Any good things that we do to our parents will also be amplified tremendously. Any kind of kind speech that we do to our parents, any kind of kind action, even the kind thought, will have tremendously powerful karmic consequences in the future. And this is why you can start to see now why parents are mentioned specifically at the very beginning of the Noble Eightfold Path, because they are this enormously powerful field of merit, of demerit, the field of actions that we need to do to even have a chance of moving forwards on the Buddhist path. That is how important they are. They are right there on the Noble Eightfold Path. So because of that, we should be very careful, and we should actually, if we do intend to make serious spiritual progress in this life, we are going to have to bring our parents into the equation and do our very best at developing our minds, our actions, and our speech in a positive way towards our parents. It is so important that if we don't do it, we are going to stagnate spiritually on the Noble Eightfold Path. That is how important it is. Once you understand this view, once you have the right view that there is mother and father, that these are very karmically significant people in the world, then the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path springs up, your intention. I better be kind and compassionate towards my parents, because it is so important. And then once the intention is there, of course, the right actions, the right speech comes into effect. And then the right effort, which is the purification of the mind, maybe through metta practice, through having kind thoughts towards them. And then the satipatthana, the meditation really starts to take off when that happens. So think about it in that way. Think about the parents as a very important part of your spiritual practice, because that is what this particular aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path is saying to us. And if you remember it in that way, then it becomes something very, very powerful. So, to sum up, remember that your parents have done so much for you in life. Count it all up, think about it, allow yourself to give rise to gratitude in your heart for your parents, and then spread that gratitude out through your actions, through your speech, and also through your meditation practice. And then also remind yourself how important this is as a foundation for the entire spiritual life. And then you really have another opportunity to grow in your spiritual practice. So, that is the talk for this evening here.